The executive session is adjourned and the regular council meeting is resuming at 6:47 p.m. Councilmember Sard, Chairman of the Public Safety, Health, and Welfare Committee, do you have a report this evening?
No report, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Williamson, Chairwoman of the Building, Zoning, and Development Committee, do you have a report this evening?
No report this evening, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Schuman, Chairman of the Finance Committee, do you have a report this evening?
No report this evening.
Councilman Kelly, Vice Chairman of the Streets and Transportation Committee, do you have a report this evening?
No report this evening, Madam President.
Thank you. Councilwoman Heeman, Chairwoman of the Environmental Control Committee, do you have a report this evening?
No, I do not. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Councilman Glassburn, Chairman of the Intragovernmental Relations Committee, do you have a report this evening?
Yes, I do, Madam President. The Intergovernmental Relations Committee met June 29th, 2021 at 7:22 p.m. Present were committee members Glassburn, Schuman, and Heeman, council members Jones, Broussard, Kelly, Williamson, the mayor, the assistant law director, directors of finance, HR, and planning, and Mr. Dwayne K. Limpert. The matter on the agenda was the consideration of confirmation of a nomination of a director for safety and service. Mr. Limpert began with stating he was honored to be selected and believed he was qualified. He stated he believed he had complied with all records requests. Mr. Glassburn stated that there were concerns about family members. Mr. Limpert indicated he's not supervised by counsel. Mr. Glassburn asked if Mr. Limpert had reached out to the Ethics Commission for an advisory opinion on this role. Mr. Limpert stated he had not. Mr. Glassburn asked why. Mr. Limpert stated he's not supervised by counsel, so he didn't believe it mattered. Mayor Kennedy indicated that he had reached out to the law department to ask if there was a problem, which he stated there was no problem. Ms. Heeman mentioned that Councilman Glassburn and his wife follow the Ohio Ethics Commission guidance. Mr. Schuman asked for the opinion of the law department. Assistant Director O'Malley indicated he agreed with the mayor and that council is not the director's employer. Mr. Glassburn indicated that the guidance he received from the OEC was more restrictive than the guidance he had received from the law department, and that if the same standards exist for this matter, the relationship between the director and the council would be cumbersome. Mr. Glassburn indicated he would request an OEC opinion. Mr. Schuman asked why the chair had not asked for an OEC opinion already. Mr. Glassburn indicated he learned about the appointment the week before and that the mayor had requested the confirmation by the end of June, which at the time was 5 days. Ms. Heeman agreed for the need for an OEC opinion. Mr. Glassburn asked if Mr. Limpert would be a full-time employee, and Mr. Limpert indicated yes. Mr. Glassburn asked if Mr. Limpert most recently worked for Bearing Service Company, and Mr. Limpert said yes. Mr. Glassburn asked if BSC did business with the city. Mr. Limpert said yes, and that they provided great cost savings for the water department, wastewater treatment plant, and the service department. Mr. Glassburn asked if the contracts occurred while he was director or on council. Mr. Limpert said he did not have a relationship while he was the service director. Mr. Limpert said there was some business while he was on council. Mr. Glassburn asked Mr. Limpert's previous employment, which he said was Maury. Mr. Kelly asked how long Mr. Limpert served as safety director under Mayor O'Grady, which was answered as 5 to 6 months. Mr. Kelly asked about Mr. Limpert's transition to service director. Mr. Limpert said his background was stronger in service, so he moved into that role. Mr. Kelly asked in the safety and service director how those would be filled at the same time. And it was answered that those were separate positions at the time. Ms. Williamson asked if BSC did business while he was on council. Mr. Limpert said he didn't have his records from the 80s or 90s, but that nothing of consequence was sold for dollars. Ms. Williamson asked again Mr. Limpert, and he said that BSC saved the city money, a considerable amount of money. Ms. Heeman asked if Mr. Limpert had the territory of North Olmsted relinquished while he was on council. Mr. Limpert stated he did interact with the city, but that he did not request credit and he believed the matter was a house account. Ms. Heeman asked about Mr. Limpert's retirement from the city. Mr. Limpert indicated he did so to prevent negative financial consequences. He stated he did not request reappointment. Ms. Heeman clarified that Mr. Limpert left to enjoy the pension benefits and not, quote, double dip, unquote, and now changed his opinion. Mr. Limpert stated the mayor asked him for help. Mr. Limpert indicated he was not prepared to answer in advance without having been asked first. Ms. Heeman continued to indicate she had asked for an updated resume. After not receiving an adequate version, Mr. Limpert indicated he was okay with the employment. Ms. Heeman asked if Mr. Limpert, if the city should hire old talent. Mr. Limpert talked about the value of experience. Ms. Heeman indicated the council had been only previously offered a nominee for service but not safety. She further stated there were 8 applicants to the city for the director position. Mayor Kennedy stated he did not need to provide council nominees. Ms. Heeman stated that at least 3 of the candidates were very qualified. Assistant Law Director stated that council does confirmation, not interviews. Mr. Glassburn called for order. Mr. Glassburn asked Mr. Limpert when he was contacted for the director position. He indicated that it was 1 week prior to the nomination to council and that he felt he was qualified. Ms. Heeman asked if Mr. Limpert had been suspended as safety director. Mr. Limpert said he had disagreements with former Mayor O'Grady and didn't recall the circumstances. Ms. Heeman was ruled out of order on the merit of discussing employee performance reviews. Mr. Limpert indicated he felt he did a good job. Mr. Kelly asked about current problems with trash and bulk pickup, including yard waste. Mr. Limpert stated that he dealt with issues as director previously and that COVID was an issue and that contracts must be upheld. Mr. Kelly asked about problems with waterways and culverts in the city, including ones in his neighborhood in Ward 2. Mr. Limpert responded that he addressed those issues in the past. Mr. Broussard asked Mayor Kennedy about the 8 applicant candidates and if they were interviewed. The Mayor Kennedy indicated half or most were interviewed in person, and that occurred when he interviewed Jack Grasso. Ms. Jones asked when the director position was posted. The mayor asked the HR director. Ms. Gallo indicated it was January of 2021. Ms. Jones stated the applicants would have been interviewed in January or February. Ms. Williamson noted that Mr. Grasso was nominated before the posting. Ms. Heeman asked Mr. Limpert about getting up to speed on changes in the last 12 years. Mr. Limpert said he can handle it and asked the employees for feedback. Mr. Kelly asked about Mr. Limpert's sponsorship of the first residential property code. Mr. Limpert stated he believed it was important to have a code and enforce it. Mr. Glassburn asked if Mr. Limpert would change the code. He stated that since it was no longer under service, he would yield to the HR director. Mr. Kelly asked if Councilman Dwayne H. Limpert would have conflicts with being the chair of streets since the Safety Service Department was supervising. Assistant Director O'Malley said no. Mr. Glassburn asked if Mr. Limpert would represent himself before council. Mr. Limpert said it would be a mix of himself and others. Mr. Glassburn asked if the Safety Service Director were each individually full-time jobs, could one person do it? Mr. Limpert said yes, and that council changed it. Ms. Heeman and Assistant Director O'Malley clarified that the charter is changed by vote and some of the aspects of the position by ordinance. Mr. Glassburn stated that the Safety Service Director was vacant, only a service director had been nominated, and that Mr. Limpert indicated he was stronger in service, so how could he do both jobs? Mr. Limpert stated he was stronger in service, but he did both positions well. Ms. Williamson asked to the accomplishments of Mr. Limpert as safety director. Mr. Limpert stated he worked on safe staffing. Ms. Williamson asked further. Mr. Limpert stated it had been 15 years and was hard to remember. Ms. Williamson stated that Mr. Limpert had remembered his personnel reviews from the same time. Mr. Limpert stated he looked at his old files and that his experience as a council member and family member of firemen, that he knew what to do. Ms. Williamson answered that her daughter grew up in law enforcement but was not qualified to serve. Mr. Limpert stated his original resume provided was not meant for public review and that he had experiences as the safety director. Mr. Broussard asked about Mr. Limpert's experience with bargaining units. Mr. Limpert replied that he had experience as a director doing so, but there should be professional help. Mr. Glassburn asked Mr. Limpert if he was suspended as safety or service director. Mr. Limpert stated the safety. Mr. Glassburn asked Mr. Limpert if he would do things differently if a similar situation occurred. Mr. Limpert stated that earlier he needed a job, but now he does not, and he wishes to serve the city. Ms. Heeman thanked Mr. Limpert for his expanded resume. Ms. Heeman then asked Mr. Limpert if he had additional training in safety since being a director. Mr. Limpert stated he didn't expect to need to do so again, so he had not. Mr. Glassburn asked Mr. Limpert's knowledge, or how Mr. Limpert managed the system of wastewater and sewers previously. Mr. Limpert indicated that there were struggles with the EPA, the city was financially broke, and that he got a new Vector truck, new rate structure, and refurbished the plant. Mr. Glassburn asked for the same description of the approach to streets. Mr. Limpert said he started the rating program for streets to be fair and save on costs. He bought a crack sealer to preserve roads. Mr. Glassburn asked about the difference between the O'Grady and Kennedy administrations. Stated that the Kennedy administration stated the described systems didn't exist and asked what one would be doing moving forward. Mr. Limpert clarified that only the sewer system was financially broke. He also stated street maintenance helps home maintenance. Ms. Heeman asked that the Kennedy administration, Ms. Heeman stated that the Kennedy administration blamed the O'Grady administration and asked for clarification. Mr. Limpert indicated the O'Grady administration reduced debt each year. Director of Finance Kopfer agreed. Mr. Broussard stated that there were a number of qualified applicants prior to Mr. Limpert being contacted and asked why they had not been selected. Mayor Kennedy stated that after Mr. Grasso withdrew, he didn't want a candidate that needed to be trained. Ms. Williamson stated that Mr. Grasso was interviewed in November, but applicants were not solicited until January. Said that, the mayor said he could not recall, but that Mr. Grasso was interviewed with others. Ms. Williamson stated that it could not be correct based on the timeline. Mayor Kennedy said he didn't know. Ms. Heeman stated that Ms. Williamson was correct and the public records indicate the Grasso interview was in November and that the job was not posted. October 30th was the date. Mr. Glassburn stressed that the current nominee to be the focus, that it was fair to ask the mayor why he had changed his mind about having a director. Mayor Kennedy stated Mr. Limpert was perfect for the job and that with 6 months left and a campaign, that's all that could work. Mr. Schuman thanked Mr. Limpert for his attendance, service, public efforts, and service while elected. Mr. Schuman stated council should approve Mr. Limpert and that Mr. Grasso should have been selected. Mr. Schuman stated he would vote for Mr. Limpert. Mr. Glassburn asked about Mr. Limpert's reduction of staffing as a director and how Mr. Limpert would act now as a supervisor of 75% of city employees. Mr. Limpert indicated that he did not plan to reduce staffing, but that economics dictate means. Ms. Heeman asked Mayor Kennedy if he wanted Mr. Limpert to be the nominee. Mayor Kennedy affirmed yes. Ms. Williamson asked about Mr. Limpert's cost savings at the wastewater treatment plant. Mr. Limpert stated in detail that he made upgrades to the plant to reduce manual labor and intensive processes. Ms. Williamson asked the law director about lawsuits at the plant. Mr. O'Malley said he didn't recall about the plant, but he recalled a class action lawsuit later. Mr. Glassburn asked about new challenges and different ways of working with the public, specifically citing a survey about Clay Road. Mr. Glassburn stated the administration did not follow the response of the public, asking how Mr. Limpert would handle it. Mr. Limpert cited successful previous projects he oversaw and concerns for financial means. Mr. Glassburn clarified that the issue was that the public had been given options that the city administration could not or would not follow, so that options that cannot be done give false expectations to the public. Mr. Glassburn asked if Mr. Limpert would have changed the consulting firm for city road projects. Mr. Limpert said he would give his input, but that he was not seeking to do a revolution. Mr. Glassburn clarified that the most recent firm employed had two authors of the study, one of which is a candidate for office at the request of the mayor. Mr. Glassburn said this is a conflict on principle and appearance. Mr. Glassburn asked Mr. Limpert to prevent political candidates or firms from doing work for the city. Mr. Limpert stated he didn't have firsthand knowledge and should not opine. Mr. Glassburn asked about the future of defunct homeowners associations in abandoned common areas such as signs and cul-de-sacs with ambiguous responsibility. How would Mr. Limpert address the issue? Mr. Limpert stated in previous instances he was opposed to the city taking responsibility, but would take conveyance of the land at association initiative and sell the land and put the proceeds into the nearest park. Mr. Kelly thanked Mr. Limpert for his handling of the meeting. Ms. Heeman thanked Mr. Limpert. Ms. Jones asked Assistant Law Director O'Malley to follow up on Ms. Williamson's request with the lawsuit, citing Resolution 2011-79. Mr. Glassburn clarified the process for advancing the nomination, stating that the committee recommends favorably or negatively, but the nomination advances regardless. Further, he stated that 5 of the 6 members must vote to disapprove, since one member is conflicted out for the nomination to fail. Mr. Glassburn moved and Mr. Schuman seconded, recommending the nomination. The vote was 3-0 for the recommendation. The meeting closed at 8:59 p.m. Madam President.
Thank you.
Madam President, at this time, I move to nominate Dwayne K. Limpert for safety and service. To affirm the confirmation of Dwayne K. Limpert for safety and service director.
I'll second that.
Motion to appoint Dwayne K. Limpert as Director of Safety and Service made by Councilman Glassburn, seconded by Councilman Schuman. Roll call, please.
Mr. Glassburn?
No with comment. We all have been here a long time looking into this issue. We've needed a safety and service director for 10 months now. We've seen some of the negative consequences of that. I think all of us wanted to have a safety service director in place by now. Reality is we don't have one yet. In this instance, council moved very quickly, tried to do our due diligence. We ran into more problems than we expected. There are issues that we had to go through in executive session. The city will face some serious matters that need a safety and service director. We need to make sure that that person is in a position to do well for the city. Due to conflicts that were made to council's attention, I don't believe that the nominee will have the opportunity to work on issues that are needed to be dealt with, and it is not fair to the city to bring on a nominee that can't address those issues. So that is my reason for voting no.
Mr. Schuman?
Yes, with comment. We do need a safety service director. We have a qualified candidate who's actually served in both those positions. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Ms. Seaman?
No, with comment. I'd like to thank Mr. Limpert, first of all, for, stepping up and being interested. Thank you. My no vote is based on reasons that Mr. Limpert had multiple inconsistencies between his testimony and the records and documents that I personally reviewed for the, preparation and of the meeting and in my follow-up. Based on some of those things, I cannot, approve this candidate. So it's just unfortunate. We do need a safety service director. We needed one actually a while ago. So unfortunately, no.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Ms. Williamson?
No.
Mr. Broussard?
No.
Dwayne K. Limpert's appointment to Director of Safety and Service is not approved by a vote of 5-1. Councilman Kelly, Chairman of the Recreation, Public Parks, and Buildings Committee, do you have a report this evening?
No report this evening. Thank you, Madam President.
Are there any letters or communications to come before council at this time?
No, Madam President.
If there's anyone in the audience that would like to address council, please come to the podium, state your full name and address for our clerk. If you live in a city other than North Olmsted, please state the name of that city and proceed with your comments. You have up to 5 minutes to address council.
Madam President, a point of order. I know on your agenda, there's a report by the mayor. I'd like to give a report.
Well, I'm sorry, Mayor, there's not. It's a special council meeting. We
It's
don't
on-
normally
it's on
have
your agenda that you
reports
printed.
from the administration during, I'm sorry.
Reports, mayor, law director, and finance director, council committee.
Is that on?
It's on your agenda. It's on the agenda.
It is not. The agenda is posted at the top of the room.
It was on the last council, special council meeting agenda. It's on this one right here. I wish to say a few words.
Well, Mayor, it's public comment. We'll give the respect to the residents who would like to speak first.
Sure, I'll speak after.
Okay. Seeing no comments from our audience. Mayor?
Thank you, Madam President. I first of all want to start by thanking Dwayne Limpert for his service to the city and his willingness to come out of retirement when I asked him to. This is a guy that's been just about everything in the city and Citizen of the Year. We find ourselves in this place because my original nominee last year Jack Grasso, never received an interview. And on Tuesday, Councilwoman Heeman announced to the world that we decided not to interview him. Well, you've got one job. You shall interview the candidate that I recommend. Again, by now, I did tell council that I wanted him to concentrate on service. By now, he would be Service Safety Director, okay? So we find ourselves here because of that. And again, with 6 months left before an election, you cannot find a qualified person. Dwayne Limpert is more than qualified. So as when we talked about Jack Grasso, he listened in, him and his wife listened in on your meetings as you completely disrespected him, and he decided that it was not the right time. A few days ago, same thing with Mr. Limpert, and I was truly embarrassed for the residents that you represent. Dwayne Limpert was service director, was safety director, held multiple positions on council, knows the people as well as anyone in fire, police, service, wastewater treatment plant, knows the system as well as anyone. And Dwayne Limpert knows the city as well as anyone that's ever stepped into this building, and you call him unqualified. I look forward to hitting the ground running, but again, you know, you guys say you want something, but you just don't want to okay it. Thank you, Madam President. You got something to say?
Seeing no other comments from our audience, is there a motion to allow council to meet remotely in the month of July?
So
So
moved,
moved.
Madam President.
Second.
Motion to allow council to meet remotely through the month of July, made by Councilman Glassburn, seconded by Councilwoman Williamson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Glassburn?
Yes.
Ms. Williamson?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. Schuman?
Yes.
Ms. Seaman?
Yes.
Mr. Broussard?
Yes.
That motion passes with a vote of 6-0. Is there a motion on the floor to excuse the absence of Councilman Limpert from tonight's meeting?
So moved.
Second.
Motion to excuse the absence of Councilman Limpert from tonight's meeting made by Councilman Schuman, seconded by Councilwoman Williamson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Schuman?
Yes.
Ms. Williamson?
Yes.
Mr. Broussard?
Yes.
Ms. Seaman?
Yes.
Mr. Glassburn?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
That motion passes with a vote of 6-0. With the agenda being completed and there being no further business to come before council, this special meeting of July 9th, 2021 is adjourned at 7:09.